Hello chess friends, welcome back to our YouTube channel. In this video, we shall have a look at a very interesting chess game played by the world champion Magnus Carlsen against Aleksey Dreev. This was played in the current ongoing FIDE Rapid Championship. And of course, this is Magnus has been performing tremendously. He also defeated Aleksey in a very simplistic manner. He just shows that he's a different class in himself, and this game will this game will explore a lot of interesting qualities of Magnus Carlsen that makes him so powerful, so strong. And I don't think right now there's anyone who can really defeat him. Not even Elreza, but we'll see why he is who he is and why grandmasters how grandmasters think and why Magnus always wins his game. So white was Magnus here, and as you can see, he's down a pawn. Believe it or not, in the next 20 moves he's gonna finish this game with very much of ease. So let's dive straight into it. Well, black has just castle at the moment, so white plays rook a to c1. In return for the pawn, white definitely have some compensation. He has a lot of pressure, obviously. That's why it is to play, well, something like bishop c6. The knight is a defender of the bishop, and you can easily get the pawn at least. So obviously, white has a lot of activity against the material. So there are three main advantages in chess. One is obviously material advantage. Another is quality of pieces, activity as we call it, and the third one is gain of tempo. These are three advantages. Gain of tempo basically means doing everything with tempo, not gain on time. So basically, these are the three advantages. Black here has the material advantage. He has a edge because he has a his pawn up. But if you look at white's position, white has a lot of active pieces. Both his bishops are super active. In fact, very attractive. This bishop is threatening to go bishop c6 and attack this guy. This guy over here. This bishop is loose. White's rooks are very attractive at the same time. So yes, Magnus has compensation, excellent compensation for being down a pawn, and he perfectly converts this into a different type of advantage. So bishop to b4 played by black. Now comes rook to d4. From now on, we are going to see how Magnus works out his magic. So this is what he always does. He improves, improves, and improves his pieces. So starting with the rook to d4 improves while gaining time. Gain of tempo, right? It's one of the advantages in chess. Now comes knight c5. So black just realized that there is tremendous pressure on his position. It's better to exchange, give back the pawn, and have an equal position to fight with. But now look at what happens. Knight to c5. Well, Magnus accepts. Knight takes on b7. Magnus gets his pawn back. And in the last few moves, if anyone has made real advantage, real progress, it's Magnus because, well, this knight, if you look at it, it was on d7, it came to c5, it went to b7, and it's not really attractive over there. But this rook was on d1, and just in a few moves, now it's on b5. It's a very active piece. So anyone has benefited from this trade, it's definitely Magnus. That's number one. Now comes rook to d7, protecting it. But again, you're using a piece to protect another piece, which basically means that your piece is going to be passive, is going to be defensive, and defensive pieces are much less powerful. Obviously, attacking pieces are obviously more aggressive, more powerful, they have more scope. And again, Magnus now uses his strategy. Look for targets. This is what we have covered earlier. Grandmasters always go for target. There are two targets over here. The one is obviously the pawn on a7. That's a vulnerable pawn. We're going to see how Magnus attacks it. At the same time, the rook on f8. Now, how can Magnus manage to attack it at the same time? Reducing black's mobility to nothing. So this is how he does it. Bishop to a3. Well, obviously it attacks the rook on the first side, but it actually does a lot more. It restricts this knight from going to this squares. So obviously the knight can't go over there. That's the first thing. Another thing is now he's going to create an attack on the a7 square. Now there are multiple ways to attack, obviously. He can go rook a1 and move the bishop, or even something more active like rook c6 to rook a6. Again, Magnus is using two things which we have learned earlier. Targets, attack the weaknesses, which forces your opponent to play defensive chess. Your pieces become active. At the same time, he's activating his pieces, improving his pieces every single move. So look at this. First, he improves his rook. Now he improves his bishop. And after rook f8, rook c6, he improves another of his rook. It's a very rhythmic, beautiful, poetic play. I think Magnus plays in a very nice rhythm. Rook a6, the rook improves. Now he has a function, and the function is clearly to attack the pawn over here. And well, black can really play something as passive and as bad as rook a8, but that's really, you don't want to play that such moves against the world champion. He's gonna steamroll you after such moves. So of course, black decided, well, I'll give up a pawn, but at least I'll have a rook endgame, and rook endgames are known to be very drawish. So knight to d6 played. Black gives up a pawn. It's very interesting. Just in a few moves, Magnus was down a pawn. He equalized, and now materially equalized, and now he has both material as well as activity. So he has two of the advantages in chess. Takes, and rook takes on a7. Magnus is up a pawn, and we're going to see how beautifully he converts this position. So black plays g5, gaining space, making some room for his king. Now comes rook to b7, improves his piece, at the same time attacks the target, the weakness. This forces black to defend it. Obviously, pushing the pawn is a little too much. The pawns are very weak, and then if you really push the pawn, I think even something like rook h7 is good enough. You're attacking this pawn, and there are multiple threats. Rook g7 is coming. Really unpleasant, of course. Black is going to drop some material. So black decides, let me play passively rook f8. But this is exactly the kind of chess Magnus loves to play, squeezing game. He again improves his piece. He decides, okay, what's the only active piece you have? This rook on d6, d6. That's the only piece that can create some sort of active trouble. But apart from that, your position really is bad. So rook d7, exchanging the only active piece. And this is again a very well-known positional theme. Rook b6, black tries to avoid it. Rook b7, and now black thought, okay, rather than going in the corner where the rook is not performing anything, let's just capture. And well, this position is still theoretically a draw, but we'll see how black messed it up. Rook c8 played, g4, squeezing, improving his pawn structure, improving his advancing his pawn, at the same time controlling the h5 square, so the h pawn can't move forward. Moving the f pawn is also bad, because if we just take, and yeah, something like rook over here or rook over here, we start attacking this vulnerable weak pawns. So that's not good either. Now black plays rook to c3. We have b4, advance. Past pawns are supposed to be pushed, so we push them. King g7, king g2, you improve your king. Of course, Magnus is not going to stay back. He improves his pieces constantly. Rook to b3, b5, king to g6. Well, the king might be up to some adventure, but we know that in this kind of an endgame, when the pawn reaches the b7 square, the 7th rank, the king should be on h7 or g7, or he should be hiding behind one of his pawns, or he's gonna lose. We know that's a very well known skewer tactic over there. So b6, f5, still everything is okay. Black wants to exchange some pawns, and this is actually a good strategy when you are defending. h3, and this is where everything went wrong for black. Now, in the game he played pawn to h5. Well, he missed several things, but let us look at a normal move like f4. Now, this is actually pretty much okay for black. In fact, something like b8, king f6, b7, you can actually park your king on the e5 square. And well, I'm not really using an engine, so I don't know the evaluation. I think it's going to be an equal one. Let me just check it out once, just for safety. I think this position is absolutely dead drawn. So I'm just making sure. Well, white has some advantage over here because of the pawn, but it was still better. White has a slight advantage over here, but not absolutely crushing. But what happened in the game was a simple tragedy. Basically, the point is, whenever the rook goes on the last rank and the pawn is on the 7th rank, white is just threatening to move the rook and give a check. So your king should be hiding behind your pawn, or he should be on the g7 and h7 square in order to avoid rook h8 move, which basically is a skewer. For example, if you put this over here, we know that Rook h8 simply wins because now we are threatening to promote. If you take this guy, rook h7 is a skewer. So basically the entire point of this endgame is you need your king on g7 or h7 or hiding behind your pawns. And in this case, if you do that, you have some saving chances. This was, I think, the best defensive try. Black could have tried over here. Still, of course, white is slightly better. So f4 over here should have been tried. But this is where Aleksey Dreev went wrong. He plays h5. Now, at the first sight, it looks nothing. This move doesn't look wrong, but there are several things that are wrong with this. Let's look at it. Magnus obviously understands his position and he evaluates and judges the position perfectly. This is the best quality he has. He realistically evaluates the position without overestimating or underestimating his chances. White captures, king takes. We know that the king is misplaced. If we have the position king, rook b8 and pawn on b7, all white needs to do is move the rook with a check and promote. So that's a big threat. Rook to b8, we are going to have the setup we want. The black king tries to rush quickly to the g7 or the h7 square, which is a defensive stance, onto b7. Now rook g8 check followed by promotion is going to happen. So black puts his king on the g7, the defensive formation. Of course, there are some certain problems with this. White can still improve his position as the black's rook is stuck over here on the b file, and the king doesn't have much more activity. In fact, he can only go to h7 and g7. So basically, this is the exact kind of position you want, and this is the exact kind of position Magnus wanted. Now he just needs a kind of a pawn structure which he can use for his advantage, and this is how he achieves it. Pawn to e3 improves. Black plays pawn e5, pawn to f3. Excellent move. Obviously, you can't really capture because if you take, this rook can give a check. I think even better is you don't need to give up the rook. Just move the rook somewhere here, and you're promoting. And well, black just has to give up the rook, but that is obviously winning for white. So going back, you can't really touch the pawn. So black played rook to b1, just holding the position. And this is where Magnus shows his class. He plays e4. Now, this is a very strong move. In fact, the idea is in the game, it captures was played. We are going to soon look at what happens if f4 is played. But let me just show you what happens if takes. This happened in the game. And just after two moves, black resigned. So white captures. We have this interesting pawn structure. It is possible for pardon me, it is possible for white to reach this particular pawn on the e5 square. In fact, it's a very simple route over here, here, or directly from here. And the moment we get the pawn, we are winning. And it turns out that black can't really do much to stop this. So let me just show you the continuation. Rook b3 was played, king f2. He stops us from, he basically cuts off from the third rank, but our plan is going to be simple. e2, d2, c2. We're going to improve c3, c4, d5. We are going to capture the pawn. Meanwhile, black can't do much. His king has to stay on the g7 and the h7 square, so he can't defend the pawns. At the same time, his rook must be all the time guarding the b file. He can't move away from the b file. So basically, all white has to do here is march his king here. The rook moves, and then you advance and capture this pawn. As simple as that. You'll have another pass pawn. You'll have a very simple victory. And this is where, after the move king to f2, that black resigned here, and Magnus obviously won the game with style. So I think this is a typical Magnus Carlsen game. He has this tremendous knowledge of endgames, and he knows exactly what he's looking for. By the way, if pawn to f4, this is also absolutely losing for a black. A move like h4 does the magic. Something like here, we just take. By the way, let me just show you what happens. Obviously, if takes, this obviously is very bad. Just king h3, and we just capture the pawn. By the way, you can't really protect the pawn because here, this is again giving me exactly what I want. I just play king g4. Your rook is forced to go back, and now something like king takes pawn. I get your extra pawn. Now I'm gonna simply approach the other pawns. This. Very simple win. So no matter what black plays against this setup, he's lost. And this just shows us the great understanding of the world champion, how well he's versed with this end games, and he just, I think the best quality that Magnus has is his perseverance. He just keeps on trying, keeps on squeezing his opponent, and yeah, he has, as Kasparov said, he's the mixture of two of the most deadly players in the history, Fischer and Karpov. He has the qualities of both of them. That is what makes him such an incredibly powerful player. So, hope you enjoy this excellent game. This is why Magnus always wins. There are multiple things. He always activates his pieces constantly. There's no stopping. He just keeps on improving his pieces. He looks for targets in his opponent's position. He goes for these tiny targets. He keeps attacking them, which makes his opponent's pieces defensive, go on the defense, and that's how he improves. And after all of that, he has this tremendous knowledge of end games, which I think which is just way above any of his rivals, which puts him right at the top of all of them. So, hope you enjoy this video. Thank you for watching and do subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time.